Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back with our next installment looking at Battle Angel Alita. And this is a pretty important part of the story because it sets up the final act. This is book 6 of 9, so after this, we are 2/3 of the way through the story. And this is actually not the end of the second act, for lack of a better way to put it. It's sort of a transition period. I suppose you could consider this the introduction to the third act, but much of the what happens in the third act is separate from this particular story. And I call this segment Figures because it sketches us an idea of who all the important players are going to be. And it does so less from Alita's point of view and more from the point of view of Figure 4. And it's a fascinating examination of the central theme because Alita is working for Zalem, which represents, as I've said before, the order side of the order versus chaos dichotomy that runs through this story. And the entire story is about balancing your impulses, your chaotic nature, against your desire for a stable living environment, for order, for a social structure that benefits you. And Kishiro, in this part of the story, is showing us what is going to create order in Alita's life going forward. Up until now, that character has been Ito, but as we will eventually see, that can't really be the source of structure and order in her life any longer, even though he continues to be an important character in her life. So we start off with a chapter where we see Alita right after her defeat of Zappin in his ascended form. And she is taken in by the factory, and because she used a gun in fighting Zappin, she's actually put on trial, and one of the deckmen, which is these little cylinder-looking guys, tells her this is a Class A felony, and we're going to execute you because you used a firearm, which is against factory law. They really don't care that she destroyed Zappin. Honestly, Zappin would probably, maybe, have been destroyed by Typharis eventually. The Berserker body is very powerful. It's a very advanced cyber system, but it's also a very old one, and Typharis technology is state-of-the-art. We never really get a clear idea of what they're capable of versus the Berserker body. We will see Alita using what is known as a tuned frame, or a tuned body, in this story. In fact, you can see it right here on the cover of this volume. But we never see it compared directly to the Berserker, so we don't really know whether Zalem Cybertech is better than the Cybertech that created the Berserker, which is, I believe, Martian Cybertech. I don't know if we ever canonically got that in this series or not, but I believe the Berserker is Martian Cybertech. I assume it would be, however, based on some of the things we get. One of the things we know for sure is that the Tuned are a nano-based cyber body. They use that for a lot of the organs and internal systems, where the Berserker body was not. It was the addition of nanotech from Destiny Nova that actually turned it into what Zappin was able to become. And that does mean it might actually have been superior to anything that Zalem or the factories could have thrown at it, but they also had a pretty significant advantage in numbers. My point with all this is the factories are perfectly willing to execute Alita because she broke factory law, and they are the representatives of Zalem, the ultimate source of law or at least the ultimate representation of law in Kishiro's universe. So, obviously, they're going to follow the laws no matter what. However, we are introduced to this fascinating character. This is Inspector Bigot. Yes, really. And he is from... We don't get the name of the organization in this group, in this book, but he is from Zalem. He is the leader of the Medical Investigation Bureau in Zalem, and that's pretty much their highest legal body, for reasons we'll understand later. Right now, what's important is that there's been a little mascot character. I never mentioned it because it's really not story important until now. It doesn't do anything but follow Alita around and look cute. It looks kind of like this, and it's kind of background decoration in a lot of scenes. Alita has had it since her motorball days, and it has been watching everything she's done. And it turns out this is kind of a scouter that Zalem has sent down, and they're trying to recruit highly skilled warriors to be their enforcers on the surface. They are looking to hunt down Destinova. They want to recruit Alita to do it. And originally, she's against this idea because she doesn't know what she's being recruited for at first. But when she finds out that they're hunting Nova, she's like, okay, I know Ito and Nova were together when last I saw them. Nova was going to try and heal Ito after he was killed, or at least gravely injured by Zappin. So she decides, okay, this is my chance to get out from under this death sentence and go looking for Ito. So she leaves. After that, there's an important setup series of events, just like 3 or 4 pages here, where we see Vector, our good old boy there with his sunglasses, thinking things over. And right away we notice he's got a few more lines on his face. He's always been a bit of a thin, emaciated guy, but he looks even more so now. And he's commenting on various things that have happened. He sets up a group called Barjack and their leader Den, who is this very intimidating-looking Centaur-type guy in the background. We won't see Den in person for quite some time, but he is very important in this whole book. He leads the Barjack brigand group, and they have been robbing the factories. And that makes them a problem for Vector, for the factories, for Zalem. But right now, Den's not the most important thing. What is important is actually Barjack. And while Vector is talking about these things, he looks out the window, and he sees Alita down there in the crowd. And there's just a moment of brief recognition, then he thinks, well, that can't have been anything. It's been years since the factories executed her. And this is a really effective framing sequence because it tells us what the major conflict is going to be. We're going to be dealing with Barjack, and it gives us an idea of how long it has been since we last left Alita in the previous chapter. It's been several years. Everyone thinks she's dead. She's been operating on behalf of Zalem, and nobody really knows about who she is or what she's been doing anymore. Apparently, most people's memories of her have kind of faded. So, we move forward, and we know that Barjack has been attacking trains that bring supplies into the factories for shipment up to Typharis. There's apparently a network of farms in the wilderness out around the factories and Scrap Iron City. So these trains are very important, and they've been hijacked by Barjack repeatedly. And naturally, that makes the trains the interesting place to go. We heard Vector saying that they're going to be offering guards on the trains even more cash than they were previously. So we got this guy. He's out there recruiting. He's saying this is a really great job. He doesn't mention anything about Barjack or the train robberies or all the people who have died. And people are signing up. And we see this cyborg come up, and he tosses a guy out of line because the train was full. It didn't need any more guards. And he's like, okay, you've got a spot for me now. And the guy he tossed aside gets up, and we're introduced to Figure 4. He's this likely-looking fella with the bulging muscles there. Figure is fascinating because he is the only fully human character in this section of the story. Well, I guess Yolg is fully human too. But he's the only human in this section of the story who can stand up to a cyborg. Honestly, Ito probably could too. We've seen him do some really impressive stuff with that rocket hammer, but even he was pretty reliant on the element of surprise in his hunter-warrior activities, whereas we see that Figure actually punches out a cyborg. And we learn eventually that Figure has learned to perform a technique similar to Alita's Herze Heonin, basically a punch that vibrates at an ultrasonic frequency and thus shakes a cyborg's brain in its skull and can still knock them out even though it doesn't break armor or anything like that. It's a very impressive physical feat. Probably not actually possible, but it is part of the conceit of this science fiction story that, hey, if you hit a cyborg in the right way with the right technique, you can basically rattle their brain and knock them out. So Figure takes this guard job. He meets 2 very important characters. One of them is Yolg, this weird-looking guy with the lips there. Speaking of characters with lips, the other one is, of course, Alita. So Figure is our viewpoint character for most of this story. We get to know who Alita is and what her outlook on life is through Figure's eyes. And that's very interesting because up until this point, we haven't really had the viewpoint of a normal person. Even Ito is from Zalem. He's kind of a superhuman. Not so much in terms of physical ability, but in his mental ability, in his education, in his technical expertise. Figure is kind of a physical superhuman. I mean, he can do this, I forget what it's called, Teo, something like that, strike that can knock out cyborgs, and that is definitely superhuman. But he's a lot less superhuman than just about anything else in the story. He doesn't have a rocket hammer. He does have a gun. He gets a gun that he's rented from the factories, because factories are allowed to keep and use guns, of course, even though regular people are not. But he's nothing really special. So obviously the train he's on gets attacked. There's a thrilling sequence where they fight off the bandits semi-successfully. We see several of Alita's neat tricks that she can do as a member of the Tuned. She has a spy satellite that supports her and tips her off to the fact that there are bandits out there preying on the train. But that's not enough warning to save the train. The bandits blow up the tracks, train derails, there's a big fight. Eventually the train, which is nuclear powered, its power plant melts down and it explodes, which is not really what happens when a nuclear power plant melts down, but it's not the point. It's very dramatic. And honestly, factory tech is pretty slipshod, so I could see it exploding. So she, Yolg, and Figure, who are the only survivors from the train, obviously they're the only characters we know, they escape, and they run into this weird-looking guy called Knucklehead, and his body is basically just a brain on a face that looks like turbines, and he rides a motorcycle. And he's the leader of the Barjack assault team that they wiped out. Alita beats him, and they're trying to use him to gain information on Barjack. But things don't go very well because the meltdown of the nuclear power plant created a huge cloud of superheated steam. It hit a pressure front, and the result is a radioactive tornado. And as Alita and company try and outrun it in their Jeep, they get picked up and thrown in the air, much to the annoyance of Director Bigot, who has been telling them to get out of the way. Oh, I guess he's a chief. Excuse me, Chief Bigot. I can't get over that name. Anyways, he's annoyed, and they get picked up and thrown away. And at this point, the chief essentially cuts Alita off. He stops supporting her with all of his nifty tools, his satellites and whatnot, and he stops talking to her over the radio. And when Alita wakes up, she's stuck on the top of this high-rise where their Jeep was apparently dropped by the tornado. But she's dangling like that, not because that's how she fell out of the Jeep, but because Figure has tied her up that way and is leaving her dangling. Figure and Alita are not on very good terms at the moment. Figure is not very impressed with Alita's very cavalier attitude towards life. He thinks she's a battle nut, which is true. And he just generally is not impressed with the way she acts. And although she's a cyborg, he's pretty sure that if she, tears her way out of those wires, she'll just drop and splat. And since Alita never tears her way out of the wires, we assume that to be true. And it kind of is true. More on that in a minute. So there's a lot of interesting character work where Figure and Alita talk for a little bit. We learn about Figure's background. He's from a place called Alhambra, which is an old city where the waters have risen and drowned a lot of the ruins. Every so often they have these really gnarly-looking sea serpent things come in, and they hunt them. It's a really interesting part of the world to hear about. Unfortunately, we never actually go to Alhambra, so we never get to see much about it. But Alita and Figure argue, and they get to know each other. There's obviously sexual tension between these two. This is a budding romance. Even, they've started off not liking each other very much. There are some interesting elements in here, like we're reintroduced to Alita playing the harmonica, so she's kept her music up. And Figure says he used to play harmonica, but he's not very good at it anymore. So that's an interesting element between the two. But eventually, they're out there in the open making a lot of noise. And they're spotted by Barjack. And there are some pretty good hints that Barjack is in the area. Most notably, while Yolg and Figure are scavenging, they find fresh cans of canned goods, which means there must be somebody holed up supplying fresh goods as opposed to old stuff. We don't know how old stuff is. One of the things that's never clearly answered in the text of the story is how long ago the surface world fell into ruins. So we don't know how new cans are. But these are pretty new. They actually look kind of clean, unlike some of the other cans we see in the wilderness. So Barjack comes back, and there's a really long sequence of betrayals and backstabs and shenanigans, let's say. Again, I don't want to give away the whole story here. I'm really just here to analyze the elements of the story structure, the character moments, and the world building. And what's really important is twofold. First, Figure decides that he's going to, at one point, he can run and he can leave Alita to fight with Barjack, because what does he care? He's not from the factories or from Zalem. He's got no dog in this fight. He doesn't even know Ito or Nova. But he decides that in his long wandering since he left Alhambra, he's been looking to understand what freedom is. And he decides that freedom is not just being alone or having no one relying on you. It's seizing control of the rudders of your own destiny. And this is the sign that Figure has come to find balance in his life between his impulses, his desire to be alone, his desire to have freedom, his desire to do whatever he wants with no one relying on him, and his desire to enjoy social ties, his desire to have community, his desire to be in fellowship with other people. And of course, right now, the person he most wants to be in fellowship with is Alita, because he's sweet on her. And that is often the way loner men tend to get anchored into society. They find a woman that they really want to form a long-term relationship with, and they begin to say, okay, I'm not just going to do whatever I want. I'm going to try and find this balance between my desires, the desires of my partner, and how we build a family around, balancing these two things. And so I think it's a very important first step that Alita has left her father figure, Ito, not by her own volition in this case, but she has found someone that she is sweet on. And she is sweet on Figure. She's impressed by his courage to stand up to cyborgs, his ability to actually fight them, not most effectively. Alita actually spars with Figure at one point, and she wins pretty handily because she has a really high-performance cyber body, and he's a meat person. But it's still impressive that he can even keep up with her, which he does, because, again, he's just a meat human. He's not a high-performance combat cyborg. So that wins Alita over, and it's an important starting point for Alita building her own sense of balance. Before, she was balanced by Ito, but you can't just live in the footsteps of your parents your whole life. Eventually, you have to step out and make your life your own. And very often, part of that is forming a family of your own. And Figure represents Alita's first steps in that. So I think the meeting of these two is a very important part of developing her character and showing how she is going to balance these impulses, the chaotic impulses she has, and at the same time, her obligations to society, her emotional bonds to other people, first and foremost, as she builds her family, and then from there, as she builds a world in which her family can flourish. And we're going to see that continue to grow and develop through the rest of the story. The other thing we see is the establishment of Den as an ally of Destinova. That's not entirely true, but they know each other, and they have a particular kind of relationship which many people around them see as friendship. And Alita is, of course, going to try and leverage that to get another confrontation with Nova. We haven't really heard or seen a whole lot of him. We haven't run into another cyborg he has modified like he did with Makaku or Jeshugen, but it's very likely, given everything we know, that Den is one of these cyborgs that has been enhanced by Nova. It's not entirely true, but it's a logical conclusion from what Alita knows so far. And giving us these hints and these elements and these pieces is a great part of storytelling and foreshadowing and building up this character who is really very important to understanding not just who Destinova is, but what Zalem is and what the world is and how all these things push and pull against each other. Probably the most important part of that, I don't know if I can find it, is when... so I don't have a quote here, but the leader, not Knucklehead, but his commanding officer, who rescues him from Alita, tells us that Den's goal is to destroy Typharis. This whole time, Typharis has just sort of floated above Scrap Iron City, and it does take from Scrap Iron City. It gets all the resources that it needs to survive from the surface, and it puts very little back into the surface. I suppose you could consider the factory system that sort of maintains law and order to be a contribution it gives back, but it's not a very big one, let's say. Zalem doesn't do a lot for the surface, and Den wants to destroy Zalem. And so here we see that the two forces are in conflict on the large scale as well. Zalem and the Scrap Iron City have been in conflict really from before the beginning of the story, but it's about to be personified for us very strongly in the character of Den. And the build-up to that in this book is quite good. You really can't take this out of the story and be okay. And it's really a pretty tightly written, fast-moving story for what it is. But it's also a much smaller and more personal story than a lot of the story up until this point. Even the battle with Makaku was pretty big and bombastic. And while there are some crazy action scenes in here, really this story is pretty small. It's about Alita, it's about Figure, and to a lesser extent, it's about Yolg. And this personal element to the story is very important to introduce because Alita does have to go through a lot of character growth in the second half of this story, and this is really where all the specifics of that are laid down. Very important stuff, even if it doesn't seem like the kind of high-stakes, high-impact storytelling that Kishiro has been doing up until this point. Still quite good, very different, and honestly, kind of a refreshing break after the Zappen storyline, which gets quite big and high stakes at the end. And I think that this kind of alternating storytelling, because we also had a pretty small and personal story with Hugo as well, even though that set up the very big and bombastic Motorball storyline, and of course was the primary initiation for the conflict with Zappen as well. These kind of small personal stories really let us get in touch with Alita, who she is, where she's at in life, before we throw the really big stuff at her. And so this is very necessary, even if it doesn't feel like it's doing a whole lot right away. This is the foundation block upon which the rest of the story, the next 3 volumes, are going to hinge. So very important to have here, pretty well executed. There are some little things. Knucklehead and a lot of the Barjack guys are kind of as antagonists. At this point, Kishiro begins to lapse into what I call gun porn, or just tech porn. You see a lot of Alita's gizmos and gadgets getting like their own little footnote stat blocks and things like that more and more in starting around here. You get like these kind of little tech dossier panels. It feels a little excessive. I really didn't need to know that much about the weaponry and the tech that these characters are using to appreciate the story, which is really the best part. There have always been footnotes in Alita. That's just part of Kishiro's writing style, for lack of a better way to put it. I think you could make a pretty reasonable argument that it's getting excessive at this point, and as the story goes on, this will continue to happen. Not as much in this, but if you read Last Order, the sequel that he did many years later, it gets a lot worse than that. Which is not to say that's a terrible manga. It's very enjoyable, but it's not as good as this. So, anyways, all in all, an important part of the final part of the story that does a good job of setting up everything that's going to happen later. You can't take it out. It's not the most thrilling stuff all of the time, but it is pretty good. So, let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.